The wind howled through Briar's Hollow like a lost soul. It was the kind of wind that snatched leaves from the ground and sent them spinning through the darkened streets. The autumn air was sharp and biting, cutting through the thin fabric of Emily Blake's dress as she hurried down the dirt road toward home. Above her, the towering trees of the whispering pines stood like silent sentinels, their long branches creaking with every gust. Halloween was tomorrow, and the town had begun its annual preparation for the Harvest Festival. Orange lanterns flickered in windows, jack-o'-lanterns grinned from porches, and garlands of dried corn husks hung across doors. But the festive decorations did little to comfort Emily. There was always something different about Halloween in Briar's Hollow. A shadow hung over it, one that the adults tried to ignore, and the children instinctively feared. This year, that shadow felt heavier. She glanced back at the forest's edge. It always seemed to be watching, waiting. The whispering pines had a reputation. It wasn't just the strange sounds that slipped from between the trees at night. Half-heard voices on the wind, whispers that no one could quite place. It was the fact that people stayed away, especially after dark. No one could remember when it started, but over the years the forest had become a place of warning, a place mothers told their children never to stray too close to. Emily knew those warnings well. Her mother had repeated them often enough. "Stay away from the trees, Emily. That's where she lives," her mother had said when she was younger. Her voice was serious, eyes glancing toward the forest as though someone, or something, might be watching. Back then, Emily didn't ask who she was. The warnings were enough. But now, at 14, Emily was older. The eerie tales of ghosts and curses felt more like stories meant to scare her, to keep her from exploring too far into the woods. The house came into view, its weathered white paint dimly glowing in the twilight. A two-story structure set back from the road, surrounded by the thickets of untamed wilderness. Her family had lived there for generations, a relic from the town's early days. The house creaked with age, and the wind often caused the windows to rattle like restless spirits trying to get in. Emily quickened her pace. As she approached the front steps, something caught her eye. A figure, barely visible, standing at the edge of the whispering pines. Her heart skipped. She froze, squinting into the fading light. The figure was a woman, dressed in a long, dark dress, her face obscured by shadows. For a moment they stood there, locked in stillness. The woman didn't move, didn't make a sound, but Emily felt a sudden chill race up her spine. "Emily! Come inside, it's getting dark!" Her mother's voice shattered the quiet, breaking her trance. She blinked and turned toward the house. When she glanced back, the woman was gone. The trees swayed gently as if mocking her fear. Inside, the house smelled of baked bread and wood smoke. Her mother was setting the table, her back to Emily. "Wash up for dinner, dear," she said without turning around. Emily moved toward the sink, but her mind was still outside, lingering on the figure she'd seen. "Mom, do people ever go into the whispering pines?" Her mother paused for a moment, then resumed her work. "No, they don't." "Why not?" "Because," her mother said, her voice low, "that's where Eliza Crowley was buried, and no one goes near her grave." Emily frowned. The name felt familiar, like a forgotten story whispered on a cold night. Who was Eliza Crowley? Her mother sighed, placing a dish on the table with more force than necessary. "She was a witch, Emily. She was hanged over 200 years ago for cursing this town." Emily's heart fluttered. A witch. Suddenly, the figure at the forest's edge didn't seem like a trick of the light. "Now," her mother continued, turning to face her with a serious expression. "Don't go asking more about it. Some stories are better left in the past." But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that the past was closer than her mother realized. The next morning, Emily couldn't stop thinking about the woman in the woods. Had it been real? Or just a trick of the fading light? Her mother's warning about Eliza Crowley lingered in her mind, but it only deepened her curiosity. Who was she, really? And why had she been hanged? The more Emily thought about it, the more she felt drawn to the Whispering Pines. By afternoon, the town was bustling with Halloween preparations, but Emily's mind was elsewhere. After school, she found herself standing at the edge of the woods, staring into the dense tangle of trees. A cold wind blew through the air, carrying a faint whisper that seemed to call her name. It was probably just the wind, right? Emily hesitated, her heart pounding. She glanced back at the houses behind her. No one was paying attention. It was now or never. Taking a deep breath, Emily stepped into the forest. The moment she crossed the threshold, the air changed. It was colder, and the trees seemed to close in around her. The ground beneath her feet was soft with years of fallen pine needles, and the smell of damp earth filled her nose. The deeper she went, the quieter it became, as if the forest had swallowed all sound. She wasn't sure how far she had walked when she saw it. Hidden beneath a thick carpet of moss and brambles was a weathered stone. It was half buried, almost completely obscured by the undergrowth, but something about its crooked angle and the way the earth seemed to shift around it told Emily it was more than just a rock. Kneeling down, she brushed aside the leaves and dirt. A name was faintly carved into the stone. The letters were worn, nearly unreadable, but with a bit of effort, Emily could make out 2 words. Eliza Crowley. Her breath caught in her throat. She had found the grave. The unease that had been bubbling beneath her surface since last night now surged into full-blown dread. Eliza Crowley's grave, hidden and forgotten deep within the woods. Emily's fingers hovered over the stone, and as she touched it, the temperature dropped even further. The air felt heavy, pressing down on her chest, and a sudden gust of wind rushed through the trees. She froze, her hand still on the gravestone. For a moment, the wind didn't sound like the usual rustling of leaves. It sounded like a voice, soft and distant, but unmistakable. Emily. Her heart raced. She pulled her hand back as if the stone had burned her. It wasn't possible. It had to be her imagination. But the voice had been so clear, almost like it had been right behind her. She spun around, half expecting to see someone there. But there was nothing. Only the trees, standing tall and still, as if they were watching. The wind died down and the forest fell into an eerie silence once more. Emily took a shaky step back, her pulse pounding in her ears. She needed to leave, now. But as she turned to go, something caught her eye near the base of the gravestone. It was a bundle of dried twigs, woven together like some kind of charm. A chill ran down her spine. Who would leave something like this here? She backed away from the grave, her foot catching on a root. She stumbled but managed to regain her balance, breaking into a hurried walk, her eyes darting around the trees. The whisper started again, faint at first, then growing louder. But they weren't just random sounds. They were words half-formed and hissing, like something ancient and angry was stirring all around her. Her heartbeat thundered in her chest as she pushed through the undergrowth, desperate to get out of the woods. When she finally broke free from the trees and into the open air, the whisper stopped abruptly. The warmth of the autumn sun hit her skin, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed her out. She ran all the way home. By the time she burst through the front door, Her mother was waiting in the kitchen, an eyebrow raised. "You look like you've seen a ghost, child." Emily could only nod, her mouth dry, the words stuck in her throat. She had seen something, and whatever it was, she knew it wasn't finished with her yet. She glanced back through the window toward the whispering pines. In the distance, the trees seemed to sway with an unnatural rhythm, as if they were beckoning her back. The next day, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She hadn't told her mother about the grave, about the whispers, or about the woven charm at Eliza Crowley's resting place. Part of her wanted to believe it had all been her imagination, but the cold fear still clung to her, gnawing at the edges of her mind. After a restless night filled with strange dreams of dark forests and shadowy figures, Emily decided she had to know more. If Eliza Crowley really was a witch, what had happened to her all those years ago? And why had her grave been hidden so deep in the forest, forgotten by everyone? The town's small library was as old as Briar's Hollow itself. Dusty shelves lined with leather-bound books filled the air with the scent of yellowed pages. Mrs. Hargrove, the elderly librarian, peered over her spectacles at Emily as she approached the counter. "Hello, dear. Can I help you with something?" Mrs. Hargrove's voice was gentle but firm, like a teacher who knew when a child was up to no good. "I'm looking for information about someone who lived in Briar's Hollow a long time ago," Emily said, choosing her words carefully. "Eliza Crowley. Do you have anything about her?" Mrs. Hargrove's expression tightened ever so slightly. She glanced toward the back of the library, where the archives were kept. "Eliza Crowley, you say? Not a name I hear often anymore." She hesitated for a moment, as if debating whether to say more. "You'll find what you need in the town records. I'll take you back." Emily followed Mrs. Hargrove down a narrow hallway to a small room in the back of the library. It was filled with old books, ledgers, and yellowing newspapers. The Crowley family was... well, they were part of the town's darker history, Mrs. Hargrove said, her voice low. "Not many like to speak of them these days." After a few minutes of searching, Emily found a thick leather-bound volume labeled Briar's Hollow Historical Records, 1700 to 1800. Her fingers trembled as she flipped through the fragile pages until she found what she was looking for: Eliza Crowley's trial. Her eyes scanned the document, and a chill crept up her spine. The words were stark, filled with accusations of witchcraft, curses, and strange occurrences that had plagued the town during Eliza's life. But there was something more. Emily's heart skipped a beat as she read the names of those who had testified against Eliza. Several of them shared her own last name. The Blakes had been among those who condemned her. Emily's breath quickened. Her own ancestors had helped seal Eliza's fate. The records went on to describe Eliza's execution, hanged at the edge of the whispering pines for her supposed crimes. Her final words, according to the document, had been a curse on the town, promising vengeance on the families that had wronged her. The families. Emily's fingers tightened around the edges of the page. The curse had been real, and her family was part of it. The weight of that knowledge pressed down on her, a suffocating sense of dread filling her chest. No wonder her mother had always warned her to stay away from the forest. Had her mother known about the curse all along? Suddenly, something cold brushed against the back of her neck. She spun around, her heart racing, but there was no one there. The room was empty, the only sound the faint rustle of paper as the pages of the open book shifted in the still air. But the chill remained, creeping down her spine like icy fingers. Shaken, Emily closed the book and hurried back to the front of the library, her mind racing with everything she had just learned. The curse wasn't just a story, it was real. And if Eliza Crowley's ghost had returned, then her family was in terrible danger. As she left the library and stepped back into the chilly autumn air, Emily's thoughts raced. If the curse was still active and her family was part of it, then that meant she was part of it. Was that why she had seen the figure in the woods? Was Eliza's ghost coming for her? Emily quickened her pace, her heart pounding in her chest as she headed home. She had to warn her mother, had to figure out a way to stop whatever was coming. But deep down, she wasn't sure there was anything she could do to stop the centuries-old curse from taking its toll. The whispers began again, faint at first, carried on the wind. As she neared her house, they grew louder, curling around her like unseen tendrils. The words were too garbled to understand, but the intent was clear. Eliza Crowley had been wronged, and now she was coming to collect her debt. The following night, the house felt different, heavy, as if the walls themselves were watching. Emily sat at the kitchen table, staring at the window where the whispering pines loomed like dark giants against the evening sky. Her mother moved around the room, preparing dinner, unaware of the tension gnawing at Emily's nerves. "I found something," Emily finally blurted out, her voice barely above a whisper. Her mother glanced at her, curious but busy, not sensing the urgency. "What's that, dear?" "In the woods," Emily continued, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "I found Eliza Crowley's grave." The clatter of the spoon her mother had been holding filled the sudden silence. Slowly, her mother turned to face her, eyes wide with a mixture of surprise and something else. Fear. "You didn't." Her mother's voice was tight, and her face paled as she crossed the room, sitting down across from Emily. "Tell me you didn't go into those woods." Emily swallowed hard, the weight of the past few days pressing down on her chest. "I had to know. I found the records, Mom. Our family. We were part of it. We helped." Her mother stood up so quickly her chair scraped against the floor. "You were told not to dig into that." She moved to the window, staring out into the darkening woods as if searching for something. "Some things need to stay buried, Emily. But the curse... There's no curse." Her mother's voice cracked, and for a moment, Emily saw the fear her mother was trying so desperately to hide. Not anymore. But Emily knew better. The curse wasn't dead. It was waking up. She could feel it. That night, as the wind howled outside, the house itself seemed to breathe with a life of its own. Emily lay awake in bed, the weight of the night pressing down on her chest. The air felt cold and thick, like the atmosphere before a storm. She could hear the distant creak of the floorboards, but they weren't her mother's steps. It was something else, something moving slowly through the house. She sat up, straining to listen. The sound grew louder, like footsteps just outside her room. Her heart hammered in her chest as the doorknob rattled ever so slightly. Emily's breath caught in her throat, and for a long, terrifying moment, everything went still. Then the whispering began again. At first it was faint, just a low murmur. But soon it grew louder, filling the room with a chorus of unintelligible voices. They slithered through the cracks in the walls, curling around her like smoke. Emily's pulse quickened as she pressed her back against the headboard, her eyes wide, darting around the room. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. Silence descended, thick and suffocating. Emily waited, her entire body tense, afraid to move or even breathe. Then, from the darkness at the foot of her bed, she saw it, a shadow, barely discernible, but there, moving toward her. It was a woman, her figure tall and gaunt, her long, dark dress billowing like smoke as she glided forward. Emily's breath hitched in her throat. The figure stopped at the foot of her bed, and for a brief, terrible moment, Emily met her eyes, pale, empty, and filled with centuries of rage. Eliza. The name slipped from Emily's lips before she could stop it. The ghost's face twisted, a grotesque smile spreading across her lips. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, and just as she thought she couldn't take the crushing weight of fear any longer, the figure dissolved into the air, leaving the room in total stillness once more. Emily sat frozen, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Her body trembled, her skin cold with sweat. She knew now. Eliza Crowley had returned, her vengeance aimed squarely at Emily and her family. The next few days were filled with more strange occurrences. Objects would go missing, only to turn up in odd places. Doors creaked open on their own, and at night, the whispers filled the house, louder and more insistent. Emily's mother tried to pretend nothing was wrong, but Emily saw the exhaustion in her eyes. She too had heard the voices. The worst part, though, were the dreams. Every night, Emily was pulled back into the forest, standing at the edge of Eliza's grave. In the dreams, she could hear Eliza calling to her, her voice soft but filled with a deep, unrelenting anger. "Come to me. Come to me." Emily woke each time with her heart pounding, drenched in sweat. But the feeling of being watched lingered long after the dream ended. It was as if Eliza's spirit had attached itself to her, waiting for the right moment to strike. The curse had begun its work. Eliza was back, and she wasn't going to stop until she had her revenge. And Emily knew, deep down, that she was running out of time. Halloween night arrived, and with it, a sense of inevitable doom. The air felt charged, thick with an energy that clung to everything, as though the very town was holding its breath. The decorations that had once seemed festive now looked grim and distorted in the fading light. Jack-o'-lanterns leered with wicked grins, and the sound of distant laughter was swallowed by the wind. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she watched the sun dip below the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows across the house. She hadn't slept in days, haunted by the whispers and dreams that gnawed at her sanity. Her mother had stopped speaking of the strange occurrences, but Emily knew she could sense it too. Something was coming, something that couldn't be stopped. As midnight approached, the tension in the air grew unbearable. Emily stood at the window, staring out at the whispering pines, the trees swaying ominously in the night breeze. Every fiber of her being told her not to go near the woods again, but deep down, she knew that Eliza was waiting for her. She had been calling to her, drawing her closer with each passing night. The curse was in motion, and it wouldn't end until Emily faced the ghost herself. She didn't tell her mother where she was going. She couldn't bear to drag her into this any further. Slipping out the back door, she felt the cold night air bite at her skin. The town was eerily silent, the streets empty, as if everyone had instinctively known to stay inside. Emily's footsteps were soft against the dirt road as she made her way toward the edge of the forest. When she reached the whispering pines, the wind picked up, howling through the branches like the distant wail of some unseen force. The trees seemed to shift, their twisted limbs bending in strange, unnatural ways. The forest was alive with an energy that hummed beneath Emily's skin, vibrating through the ground. With a deep breath, she stepped into the woods. The darkness swallowed her instantly. The tall pines loomed above, their branches entwined like skeletal fingers. The path was almost invisible, but Emily knew where she was headed. She could feel the pull of Eliza's grave, like an invisible thread drawing her deeper and deeper into the heart of the woods. As she walked, The familiar whispers returned, louder and more insistent now. They seemed to come from every direction, surrounding her, guiding her. The words were still impossible to understand, but the intent behind them was clear. Eliza was calling her. Come to me. The trees parted, revealing the small, hidden clearing where Eliza's grave lay. The gravestone was just as she had left it, half buried and covered in moss. But now, there was something different. The air around it pulsed with a cold, malevolent energy. The woven charm Emily had seen days before now hung from a branch above the grave, swaying in the wind like a warning. Emily approached slowly, her heart racing. The temperature dropped the closer she got, the cold seeping into her bones. She knelt by the grave, her breath visible in the frigid air, and placed her trembling hand on the stone. Instantly, the ground beneath her shuddered, and a low moan rose from the earth. Emily's pulse quickened as the shadows around her deepened. The whispers grew louder, swirling in the air like a storm. She could feel something rising from the ground, a presence far older and angrier than she had imagined. And then, she saw her. Eliza Crowley stood before her, her form flickering like a flame in the wind. She was tall and gaunt, her face pale as death, her hollow eyes locked on Emily with a look of pure hatred. Her dark dress billowed in the wind, and her long, thin fingers twitched as though itching to reach out and touch the living. Emily couldn't move. Fear paralyzed her, rooting her to the spot as Eliza's ghost hovered above the grave, her voice a low, guttural rasp. "You!" the witch hissed, her voice echoing with centuries of rage. "You are one of them!" Emily shook her head, her mouth dry, her throat tight with terror. "Please, I didn't. They wronged me," Eliza growled, her voice growing louder, the wind swirling around them with unnatural force. "Your bloodline wronged me, and now the debt must be paid." Emily stumbled back, her heart pounding in her ears. "I'm not like them," she cried, desperation flooding her voice. "I didn't do anything. I wasn't even born then." Eliza's eyes narrowed, her spectral form growing darker, more solid. "It does not matter," she spat. "The curse is bound to your blood, and blood must answer for blood." The ground trembled beneath Emily as Eliza's voice boomed through the clearing, her words like thunder. Emily scrambled to her feet, her mind racing. She couldn't run. There was no escaping this. The curse had followed her all her life, and now it had caught up with her. Eliza raised her hand, pointing directly at Emily. "You will suffer as I suffered," she whispered, her voice deadly soft. "And when the sun rises, you will belong to me." A cold hand wrapped around Emily's throat, invisible but choking the air from her lungs. She gasped, her vision blurring as the world seemed to tilt around her. This was it. The curse was going to take her, and no one could save her now. Emily clawed at her throat, gasping for air as the invisible force tightened around her neck. Eliza's ghost hovered above her, watching with cold satisfaction, her pale eyes burning with centuries of fury. The whispers around them swelled into a deafening chorus, voices of the past urging the curse to take its toll. This is it, Emily thought, her vision swimming as she struggled in vain. But something deep within her refused to give up. The curse might be tied to her blood, but she wasn't like her ancestors. She wasn't a coward who would let someone else's sins decide her fate. With a sudden surge of adrenaline, she twisted her body, kicking hard against the ground. The force of the movement broke the ghost's grip, and Emily collapsed to the earth, coughing and gasping for air. For a moment, the whisper stopped, as if stunned by her defiance. Eliza's ghost seemed to flicker, her form wavering like smoke in the wind. But then, the witch's eyes narrowed, her fury intensifying. "You cannot escape me," Eliza hissed, her voice a venomous rasp. "Your family's blood is soaked in betrayal. You owe me your life." Emily scrambled to her feet, her heart racing. She knew she couldn't run. Eliza would follow her, torment her, until the curse was fulfilled. But maybe, just maybe, there was a way to break it. She had read enough about old curses to know that sometimes there was a way out, a loophole. If she could confront the curse head-on, maybe she could end it once and for all. "I know my family betrayed you," Emily said, her voice trembling but steady. "I know they condemned you to die, and I know they were wrong. But I'm not like them. I won't let this curse control me." Eliza's ghost loomed closer, her shadow stretching across the clearing like a dark, malignant force. "You think words can undo what has been set in motion?" she spat. "The curse is bound by blood. Your blood is the same as theirs." Emily took a step back, her mind racing. There had to be something she could do to break the cycle. She thought of the woven charm she had seen at the grave. Was it a ward? A symbol of power? Or was it a key to something deeper? Something that could undo the curse itself? Gathering her courage, Emily reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing against a small shard of broken glass she had picked up from the clearing earlier. A relic from the past. A piece of something left behind by those who had condemned Eliza. She wasn't sure why she had taken it, but now it felt like it held some kind of weight. Something connected to Eliza's past. Something that might give me leverage. "Eliza," she called out, her voice shaky but clear. "I know you were wronged, and I know you've suffered for it. But this curse has done nothing but continue that suffering. For you, and for everyone, it's touched. It's time to end it." The witch's ghost hovered, her eyes narrowing suspiciously. The wind howled through the trees, and the voices of the past whispered louder, urging Eliza to take what she was owed. But there was a hesitation in her form, a flicker of uncertainty. Emily pressed on, sensing that she was close to something. "You want justice," Emily said, holding the shard of glass up toward Eliza. "But you've already had revenge on those who wronged you. My family is nearly gone. I'm the last one left. If you destroy me, the curse will die with me. But so will any chance of breaking the cycle. Isn't that what you want? For the pain to stop?" Eliza's ghost swayed, her form flickering in and out of focus as the wind screamed through the clearing. For the first time, Emily saw something in the witch's eyes besides rage, a flicker of something deeper. Sadness. Pain. She had been trapped in this cycle of vengeance for centuries, and maybe, just maybe, she wanted it to end as much as Emily did. The whispers around them grew louder, more insistent, but Eliza's gaze softened ever so slightly. Her hollow eyes locked with Emily's, and for a brief moment, the anger seemed to drain from her face. "End it," Emily whispered, her voice shaking with desperation. "Let the curse die here with me. Release us both." Eliza's ghost lingered, the air between them thick with tension. Then, slowly, her form began to fade. The winds died down, the whispers grew faint, and the cold presence that had pressed down on Emily's chest lifted. Eliza's expression softened, her pale eyes almost mournful as her form dissipated into the night. The clearing fell silent. The oppressive energy that had haunted the forest was gone, leaving behind only the sound of the wind rustling gently through the trees. Emily stood alone by the grave, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The curse was broken, or at least It felt that way. Trembling, she sank to the ground beside the grave, the weight of what had just happened washing over her. Eliza Crowley's vengeance had ended, and so had the curse that had plagued her family for generations. But Emily knew it had come at a cost. She had faced the darkness and survived, but she would never be the same. As she rose to her feet and began the long walk home, the shadows of the whispering pines no longer seemed so menacing. The curse was over, and Eliza's spirit at last was at peace.